Welcome everyone. Hopefully you can hear me and see me perhaps. This is the second of 3 events being hosted by BA User Experience Design. This graduating cohort are actually called BA Information and Interface Design, so you'll probably hear those 2 terms used synonymously. I'm Gareth Foote, and I'm the course leader for BA User Experience Design. And thanks everybody for attending. Apologies if you hear any background noise. I'm back at the LCC's Elephant and Castle campus, so we get that lovely soundscape of sirens occasionally. The format of today is, as you can see on the right, mostly about the students presenting their final major projects, diving into some of the depth of their process, and as the talk title implies, going beyond the surface of their projects, but beyond and behind the interface. We're going to have Gabe, Rebecca, then Eustace. But before we start, I'm just going to give you a quick sort of summary of this year group, a little bit of a reflection on the course itself, and a bit of a framing for the course for those of you who are not aware of it. So as I said, it's called BA User Experience Design. However, it started 6 years ago as a course called BA Information and Interface Design. And 3 years ago now, it's changed names. So this is the, 2 years ago it changed names. So this year group is the final year who will graduate as Information and Interface Design. The course has grown. Our current first year cohort is in the 30 plus numbers, which is great to see. And UX itself, as a title, is relatively well known in the design world, but it's also quite a kind of hotly contested term, and we've had a lot of discussions this last few months with the students about their the third year students about their kind of identity as designers as they leave. And I think, part of that is to do with this ambiguity around the term user experience design. It's often kind of used to encompass any digital or interface design. And the other element of kind of identity that we have to contend with a little bit on BA in IID or UXD is whether we are just a BA in websites and apps. So this is something that I'm absolutely sure that all of our students here will contest quite substantially, and you'll get to see how that it's so much more than that as well through their presentations. And in fact, this group in this graduating cohort, this group has shown me how much more this discipline can be, breaking a lot of the boundaries of what people do expect this to be. It's not simply instrumental or kind of solution focused design discipline. And this group of projects you'll see this morning and this afternoon, what ties them together is not UX methodologies, but really the kind of expansive and non-trivial and really consequential subjects that they address, and also the rigorous design-led investigations that they take on and that are required to address these kind of subjects. So, I mean, really, if anything, if the course has delivered anything for the students, it's challenged them to have an awareness, I would hope, of the kind of innate complexities in this social and political and sometimes functional and always aesthetic act of designing. So you're going to see all of those things coming through in these 3 projects. Quickly before we start, and I pass you over to our first presenter, I just wanted to remind everyone who's here to please attend the second half of this series of talks called Behind the Interface. So part 2 will be this afternoon. It'll start at 2 o'clock, and there's a bit.ly link there to register. That's it from me, and I'm going to pass you over to Gabe. and he's going to talk about his project model, which was a really, really deep investigation into digital culture and representation via some really interesting processes of co-designing using 3D design technologies. And I won't say any more. I'll let Gabe speak for himself. So over to you, Gabe.
Hello, everyone. Just setting up my share. Hope everyone can hear me. So today I'll be talking about my pride and joy of the last few months model, which is a sort of explorative magazine that, sorry, you can probably hear my dog. An explorative magazine that uses 3D technology to explore what it would be like to change different identities, explore the link between real modeling, such as fashion photography, with 3D modeling. And so what sort of is model? To put it quite simply, I'd say imagine a sort of lifestyle art magazine, a lot like Dazed or Glamour, that combines real people with their digital selves. That's what I would describe model as. I combine real participants with real interviews and transform them into 3D and discuss digital topics. So for a sort of little preview, these are a few spreads that I've done through the magazine. For example, working with a good friend of mine who's a professional model for Next Management, digitizing her on the cover and talking about what it's like to work with a 3D model and how does she feel about being seen as one, as well as going straight in another direction to working with an American streamer known as Mika Marzu, in which I created a stylized virtual YouTuber model, which is quite interesting. Working with fellow UAL grad Amida Ontilio, who is a photographer, where we talked about what it would be like to photograph a real sort of a 3D model. Would that change the way that you would work? As well as my dear classmate, Matt Richmond, talking about what it's like to be digitized and how does it feel to have someone else create a digital representation of yourself. And so this talk will mainly talk about the process opposed to the visuals, because inherently turning a person into a virtual being is very intimate and very fragile. It's quite hard to make sure that you get it right and you represent the person correctly. And so with this in mind, I created this specialized workflow, a co-design process, which I'll talk about today. Okay, well that disappeared, but it's split into 6 parts, beginning with discussion. So obviously not everyone might know what digitization is. It sounds quite arcane, especially to people who aren't sort of in the 3D facing sphere. So I talked to my participants about what it's like to turn into a model, how much input do they have to have, what's the ownership around what sort of model they're going to have and their likeness. It's a whole complexity about what sort of 3D parts you own, but inherently every participant was given the choice of having their model data, sort of the files, be deleted after the talk or after the magazine is created to ensure that their likeness wasn't used inappropriately, as well as having the final say on every design decision. So as the creative engine, I create a lot of the models, but inherently, if they don't want to be represented in a particular way, I will take that say. And so it goes quickly onto the mood board. This is probably one of the most fun parts and most like participatory parts. This is an example of a Pinterest board that I worked with a participant who really liked the styling and the clothing and the fashion of Kurt Cobain and Harry Styles. And so this stage is quite explorative, talking about what sort of real models do you like, sort of keeping that human aspect, what sort of clothes do you like, what do you wish you could wear or appear as, sort of giving it a lot more of a unique quality and allowing them to see the possibilities of basically 3D modeling, as well as the capabilities, because 3D is not unlimited. And then morph. So this is the beginning of the 3D process. Probably looks quite terrifying, but this is how you basically transfer someone's likeness to a 3D model. It's done simply through taking 3 passport photos, one from the front, the right and the left, and transforms into this beautiful mask of myself, which carries on sort of facial shape and skin texture for new realism, and basically allows me to instantly turn a 3D model into somebody's likeness, excluding hair and etc. And this is a process that is done by me and then corrected by the participant when they look at the final model to make sure it's not too, fat or slim or wrong color. And then editing is the key design process. This is where the actual 3D modeling goes on. So this involves playing around with hair, clothing, skin, lighting. This is the most complex part of the process because it involves constant collaboration. Throughout the entire process, I collaborate with my participants either through video calls, such as with the streamer, or through WhatsApp or Instagram, making sure that every single part of the model is what they'd like it to be. And this can be anything from running hair physics simulations to ensure that the hair drapes along your skin properly, or changing the beard, or creating entirely new beard textures and etc. And then that turns into the rendering stage, which is more iteration, iteration, iteration. So focusing on the details, making sure that the participant has exactly what they'd like, if they want to change any parts, as well as me making edits to make it look nice. And then compilation. So the way that I do interviews is usually I begin with the starting interview, talking about what is 3D modeling, do you know what it is? And then the rest of the interview content actually comes from this process. So through the process of morphing, editing, mood board, these conversations are transformed into an interview, which I think creates quite a natural spread, as it's much more of a conversation opposed to strict questions. And then editing and creating the spreads. And so this is a sort of preview of the models that I participated with. So this is Mika and her virtual model, my friend Matt and his virtual model, Amandine and her model, and Amina and her model. And so that's sort of the process I went through. It's a very complex process that was inspired a lot by photographers and models that I've worked with, as well as my own experience doing modeling for friends, seeing the way that stylists are involved. And so what's sort of next for this process? I am actually offering sort of experimental digitization services. So I'm experimenting with the idea of external people who want to be transformed into a digital being, for the sake of, I don't know, Instagram visuals, learning what 3D is about, and having the opportunity to experience that, as well as a new issue of Model. So this magazine was produced in issue 4, and issue 5 will be in production using the same process to create something even better. Thank you for listening to my talk. If you have questions or you want to work on something or you're interested in being digitized, these are all my contact details. Yeah, thank you for listening.
Thanks, Gabe. I think your dog's interested in being digitized. He's like very vocal.
Okay. Sorry.
No problem, no problem. Thanks very much for that, Gabe. I'm just sharing my screen now, and hopefully you should be able to see me this time very briefly. So something I didn't mention at the beginning of the talks, which I should have done, is that we're going to have a Q&A with the students at the end. So please, please, please think of some questions that you'd like to know about the project, dig a little deeper, anything that you'd like to know more about their work, their process, or the outcomes, or if you want to ask about being digitized, then throw those questions into the Q&A panel anytime. Don't just wait until the end, and we'll come back to those questions after we've done the 3 talks, so two more talks. So moving on to Rebecca, whose project SBEMU is with the subtitle, her project has the subtitle of Unfiction, World Building and Neoliberalism, which was another very substantial undertaking. The most substantial part of this to me seemed to be the kind of world building that Rebecca's really capable of. But the most rewarding thing about this was how she tied this to the politics of interfaces through this world. So trying to kind of explain alternative worlds politics through the interface that she's produced. It's a very subtle piece as well. So I would advise everyone to have a look through it, and we'll put a link into the chat to I think, is it live? Well, I'll ask you this in a minute, Rebecca, when you've turned your mic on, but is there a live version of it? You can answer that shortly. So we're going to play a video of Rebecca's recorded presentation, and that will be handled by our AV team who sat in the background. So feel free to do that now, Tommaso and Fabri.
Hi, my name is Rebecca, and I'm here to talk a bit about my final project, SVMO. SVMO is an interactive experience designed to simulate a computer used in VEFRA, a country that I've created while constructing an imaginary world, at first as a hobby, but which later evolved into something that I can basically just drop into things when I don't have a lot of other ideas. Not this one though, SVMO was designed specifically with this world in mind. The three main components of this project are storytelling, the political aspect, and the design itself, which combine into storytelling through design and politics. Just as a short introduction before I get into the meaty stuff. The plot of the project is that you go to a shady downloads website and you find something that you can't believe your eyes, an interplanetary emulator. Out of curiosity, you launch it, and to your surprise, it actually boots, and you're presented with this weird cyber Art Nouveau interface, and access to some documents from a different planet that tell a story of government overreach and the failures of liberalism. So let's start with storytelling. SVMO is a writing-heavy project because its core component is storytelling. I wanted to create something that would take place within a fictional world and to tell one of the many stories that happened there. First, some context. You need to understand what unfiction is. Unfiction isn't like an actual word that you'd find in a dictionary or even a book. While originally it referred simply to unfiction.com, a website for ARG, alternate reality game players, I've recently seen it expand its meaning. I'm not sure when the term started being used with this meaning, since I'm not part of the ARG scene, but it refers to stories that give no indication of being fiction. ARGs themselves are part of this category, but are not the only genre to fit the bill. Some examples of unfiction are Petscop, a horror web series inspired by creepypasta and resembling a Let's Play series, and In the Dark, a 2007 web series about a 23-year-old woman named Louise Paxton, who disappeared after moving from Norwich to Clapham. The plan was for SVMO to also be a proper work of unfiction, but it ended up lacking in some ways, due to the lack of time I had to properly finish the project. I didn't register a domain, I didn't turn the emulator into a web app, and instead made it run straight from a download page, and I had to add a disclaimer at the bottom of the fileware page, warning users to not attempt to go to the fake URL, because they might get their computers infected with malware. To achieve this, I attempted to tell a story through UI design. The interface of the veteran computer is familiar yet alien, using things that exist in the real world such as Art Nouveau and e-ink, and combines them in ways that don't necessarily make sense as a computer interface. This hopefully raises some questions about why this interface is the way it is, and when you start reading the articles, which I've made sure not to make unnecessarily expositive, you, again hopefully, slowly begin to understand. A surprisingly slightly less important part is the interface design itself. First, the obvious. The visual aspects are based on a combination of Art Nouveau, Art Deco, and a bit of Solarpunk sprinkled on top, but Solarpunk already takes a lot of inspiration from Art Nouveau, thanks to its organicity fitting aesthetically within the movement. In addition to this, a big inspiration was the UI of Transistor, a post-cyberpunk tech noir video game with what I can only describe as cyber nouveau aesthetic. Because I'm not an illustrator, I asked my sibling to make the illustrations on the various pages of the operating system, and the margin decorations followed a simple concept. Organic lines and routed shapes intertwined with hard, angular shapes. The OS does away with the desktop paradigm as well as Windows, and replaces that with a much clunkier book metaphor, to the point where this type of computer is called a book. Each document or application is a set of discrete pages, and scrolling doesn't even exist. To get to the next page, you have to either use the weird page flipping device that exists literally for this one purpose, or switch the writing tablet, which is literally just a glorified drawing tablet, into pointing mode, turning it from an OS-wide writing recognition mode into basically what you get when plugging a drawing tablet into any computer outside a drawing app, a slightly awkward mouse. There are a few more concepts floating around the UI that I didn't really have the time to properly flesh out, such as every location in the operating system having its own page number, or the fact that apps aren't really seen as different from files by the system. But again, time constraints kind of put a stop to all that. The ideal version of this project would have each one of these items be completely interactive, similarly to how you can basically use anything in Hypnospace Outlaw. The other major part of SVMO is the political component, which is explored at the same time as the world building. Basically, Vefra has been in more or less constant conflict with its eastern neighbor, Neres, for the past almost 700 years, 300 of which Vefra spent under Nerian control. Although still granted some degree of autonomy, similarly to how the Ottoman Empire treated territories like Crimea, Algeria, or the Romanian principalities. The last conflict between the two countries occurred almost 40 years ago when Neres suffered something of a fascist takeover and started a war against his neighbors. Neres lost, and about a decade after the start of the war, Vefra introduced a law that, while not forbidding foreign art per se, made it very hard to have any kind of art or design that didn't follow traditional Vefran guidelines exhibited or used anywhere. This is because the government started subsidizing galleries and companies that exclusively made use of art that followed its guidelines. And the situation eventually snowballed into digital tools such as music creation software, movie editing tools, and really anything more complex than writing or drawing on a monochrome e-ink page with a pen, inaccessible for most Vefrans. Major companies, both Vefran and otherwise, started to increasingly abide by these regulations in order to receive government subsidies. And the end result was that almost all digital art in Vefra can now only be created by either rich people who can afford the prohibitively expensive imported tools, and people who work at massive corporations which can easily afford the tools. The Vefran government pretends that this is in order to oppose the barbaric Nerian fascists, of course. And while there is some truth to that, Neres underwent an incomplete process similar to the denazification of Western Germany, where many fascists remained in government. The full truth is that this allows the government and the corporations to hold the monopoly on art and entertainment. The political aspect is based on the ways in which neoliberalism operates in the real world. It appears to oppose fascism at face value, while at the same time incorporating parts of it into itself. Fairly obvious examples are the overwhelming focus on personal responsibility and authoritarianism in the form of police brutality targeting labor unions and the poor. While the goals are different, fascism aims for dictatorial power concentrated in the hands of a leader and often the creation of a nationalistic empire. Neoliberalism aims for profit at any cost, but the means of achieving these goals are certainly similar. The political aspect is intertwined with the theme of interface politics, explanations and critiques of why the interfaces look and function the way they do in Vefra being more or less pretenses to analyze the overall political situation. This had to be condensed from the original plan because there were going to be 2 more articles about a clash between fascists, anti-fascists, and the police, which would have further developed the narrative, although they were caught due to time constraints, and I basically did my best to explain everything through the 2 remaining articles in this talk. Anyway, this is about all I have to talk about today. I hope you found this presentation informative and good. If you want, you can check out some more of my work on my website. Thank you for your time and for listening to my talk. I'll be looking forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Rebecca. As I said before, any questions you have for Rebecca or Gabe, please throw them into the Q&A as and when. You should now be able to see my slides again. And without further ado, that shortcut's not working. I'm going to move on to the third project from Eustace, which is called Testosterone Poisoning. And yeah, this project, Eustace and I, and many other people, and Eustace had really interesting conversations about masculinity. And the way that he's approached it was really fantastic. It's a really playful way of addressing quite serious issues we have in society. And it's also one of those examples of how design can help somebody kind of embody and inhabit other characteristics, to think through the other, think through another person's perspective. In this case, perhaps, to sort of consider the consequences of toxic masculinity. I will stop probably butchering the description that Eustace is going to give us shortly, and pass you straight over to him.
Great. Hello. Hi, guys. My name is Eustace, and I'm going to present my final major project called Testosterone Poisoning. So first, let me give you a little introductory comic to the game. So in a world where superheroes exist, you and your friends hear a really loud noise, and you realize that there's a loose, wild gorilla running around, and the gorilla, of course, attacks you and bites you guys, and suddenly you realize that you have superpowers. And no ordinary superpowers are these. These are powers to you given by testosterone poisoning. So what is testosterone poisoning? It's a role-playing card game about masculinity and its toxic forms. Often various masculinity tropes can be noticed across media, especially in Hollywood movies. And this tabletop game takes these tropes and puts them at the center of gameplay. Players become superheroes with absurd toxic masculinity superpowers, and they try to navigate the world created by stories they tell. And as you notice from the introductory comic, the game draws parallels between these superhero movies when the main character gets bitten by a spider and becomes a Spider-Man, or injected and becomes Captain America. So similar here, you get bitten by a gorilla and you suddenly have these superpowers, but no ordinary superpowers, as I mentioned. But first, let me give you a little context of why I think it's really important to talk about masculinity. So I think a lot of you probably have noticed that media often have these titles and headlines about masculinity being in crisis. And as much as our media tends to catastrophize these types of topics, there is truth in what you see. And Grayson Perry, an artist, a transvestite, an author, he says about masculinity being in crisis is like thinking that racism was in crisis in civil rights era America, and masculinity is in need of change, as old-fashioned ideas are no longer fitting in with the modern man living in modern society. And how it is affecting men right now, this toxic masculinity. Like if you look at the statistics, we know that 95% of men make the prison population. We know that 3 out of 4 of those who take their own lives are male. And as well, we know that men are so much less likely to reach out for help when confronted with mental illness. And as a man myself, I really think that it's important to kind of talk about it and approach it and bring awareness to this topic. So as I was doing research and was thinking how to approach this topic, I noticed that in a lot of our media texts, we use these masculinity, old-fashioned masculinity ideas, and they're almost, and they've been there for such a long time, and so often that they've become tropes, and tropes that have names. So we have like heroic build, which all means your amazing body, very muscular body, or carpet of virility, which is the hairy chest, or stoic look, which means having the emotional capacity of a rock. So I believe that all of these kind of movie tropes that are used in books and comic books as well kind of perfectly embody old-fashioned ideas in a quite fun and entertaining way. So I thought I'm going to use these tropes and create something educational and fun. So I decided to make a tabletop game. And this tabletop game, the reasons why I decided to make a tabletop game are a couple of them. One of them being that role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons, let's say, according to research, shows that it allows men to experience masculinity in a more inclusive way as it creates different types of environments. As well, we know that tabletop games are mostly played by men as well, according to statistics and similar. So as well important to mention that I thought that masculinity is quite a personal subject to talk about. And I really wanted for players, for people who will engage with this game to draw from their own experience. That's why I use these movie tropes and started making these cards about them. So in the end, I delivered this kind of game kit, which consists of poison cards, which are these movie tropes, or in the game, these are the abilities given to you by testosterone poisoning. And you use these cards to tell stories about your superhero. Antidote cards, which are the opposite effects of testosterone poisoning. So it's a different type of masculinity. We have mission cards as well, which tells players what are conditions of a certain mission that they need to tell the story about. We have a narrator token, which goes around and kind of a person who sets the scene, and testosterone levels that measure your progress within the game. And hopefully at the end of, to win the game, you need to fill up the tube and reach the Valhalla and get totally poisoned by testosterone. So when I was designing these cards, I really thought that it's really important for me to choose the right kind of art direction and the right way to design these cards. And I chose to go with a direction of pop art. And why it's important is because pop art in itself, like we have artists like Andy Warhol, let's say, who actually took these mundane objects like soup cans and put them at the center of display. And I thought I want to do the same thing where I'm taking these masculinity tropes that are there, but they're never the center. They're never the epicenter of everything. But that's what I'm making them here, is to be the center of the gameplay. So I designed these cards in pop art direction. I made this tube as well, which as well, like other pop arts objects, are really bright, big, stands in the middle of the game to kind of putting the presence for the players of what they're playing. Some cards I designed, for example, Permastubble, which is all about having a 5 o'clock shadow and being all sexy. Carpet of Virility, as I said. The antidote cards like Feel Your Feelings, it's all about the opposite effects. It's all about being in touch with yourself, and you use these cards to kind of progress within the game. And plot cards, who tells you like these goals that you go on a mission. So yeah, that's the game. If anyone wants to play it, let me know and we can arrange something. Thank you.
Thanks, Eustace. Great. Thank you very much. And so now we're going to set up for a Q&A with the students, with Gabe, Rebecca, and Eustace. So please, if you have questions for them, please put them into the Q&A panel now. I'll give you a couple of minutes to pop those in there. And everyone can turn their cameras on now. I'll stop sharing my screen. Welcome back. Hello, hello. And Rebecca?
Hi.
Hello. She's here. Okay, great. So, go on, Rebecca. Did you want to say something?
No, nothing.
Okay. Well, whilst we wait for people to pop some questions into the Q&A, so let's go back and start with Gabe. It feels like you've got multiple audiences in this. It feels like, or multiple stakeholders, if you like. And what's interesting your project in contrast to perhaps a different type of, or a different editorial magazine that involves interviews, is how involved the interviewees are, and they are so much more substantial stakeholder in this, have so much more personally invested perhaps than just a standard interview, because of the elements of co-design and representation. And I just wondered, and then obviously the other audience is the people kind of reading the magazine, and those two could cross over at some point, which would probably be quite nice, and I imagine what you'd like. But I just wondered if you could speak to what you think the participants got out of the process.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, my dog has conveniently started barking again, right when I have to answer. I think the participants got quite a lot out of the process. I mean, one is actually in the audience, Matt Richmond, who could talk to you a bit about it. But one piece I think he talked about was the idea of open source daydreaming, which was the idea that someone else creating a model of you could see you in a completely different way to how you see yourself. And so that could help people explore sort of identity or the way that they present themselves, and sort of through this sort of very explorative and safe environment of 3D, where basically anything can be done. There's no limitations. Someone could go through this digitization process and discover that they prefer to be presented in this way, and then make those changes in physical space. That's probably one that I could talk about.
Okay, interesting. So there's an element of being able to kind of play with your identity, play with representation a bit, to explore that. Did you find anybody had any of that classic uncanniness, that feeling of uncanniness when they see these representations that are close but not quite there?
Yeah, I think that was observed in the majority of the participants, except for my streamer friend, because hers was a very stylized avatar, and so it completely dodged that sort of issue. But yeah, a lot of them, such as Matt, like talked about having that uncanny feeling seeing it. Obviously, we all know a bit of the uncanny valley sort of. I'm hoping that when I start to develop the process more, I'll start to introduce stuff like imperfections or errors intentionally, in order to make it more human, because I think it's the perfectness of like a 3D model, such as like the completely clear skin and like creaseless clothes, etc. That makes it look quite uncanny. But yeah.
Great. Okay. Last question. And I'm hoping some of our audience can throw in some stuff to the Q&A. That would be really lovely. But what did you get out of that process with those participants?
God, a lot of things. Too much to answer. I'd say one big thing was recognizing flaws in my own design process, and the way that I do 3D work. For example, in this project, I did a lot of visual development, creating sort of futuristic models, but a lot of them were from my sort of background or demographic. And so when I was working with certain participants who are POC, I didn't have the required assets or the knowledge to handle certain parts of their model effectively. And so this process really helped me to understand how crucial it is to work with somebody who is representing something of that space. Because I would able to ask them, like, is this hairstyle okay? Could you explain to me like a bit, like, would they actually do this in real life? Because I can't really understand it. And so that's probably one thing. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Thanks very much, Gabe. And Rebecca, I wanted to ask you about the challenges of making what was seemingly an anti-design at times, i.e. something that was not meant to function well. And did that kind of come up against your instincts as a designer when you're trying to make something that doesn't function as effectively or efficiently, but you also still kind of want to make it beautiful and etc.?
Not really. Like, I only realized it's clunky and kind of stupid to use after I already had kind of like a version of it going. The hardest part was honestly just figuring out what my point was going to be with it. Before I settled down on the political themes. It was originally just supposed to be look what these people use, haha.
Yeah, that's interesting that it came quite organically then, or that you made something and that helped you reflect, and then subsequently you realized that it had the potential to hold a message, is that fair to say, or to talk about an ideology?
Yeah.
Okay. You mentioned something in the Vefra world about the expense, like at a certain point, the only people who are allowed to make creative works are those with the access to those tools. Is that right?
Yeah, like anyone was like technically legally allowed to do whatever they want to, but yeah, more advanced tools are kind of prohibitively expensive for most people because like they're just kind of like, I guess, high-tech pieces of equipment that need to be imported and aren't subsidized unlike every other kind of computer that actually sold there.
Was that in any way a reference back to sort of some of the access to tools that we have as creatives?
Kind of, yeah. Like the tools that we need to use are also pretty expensive. Before I switched to using Linux and mostly free software, I was I had to switch from the Adobe suite to I forgot the name of the other thing, Affinity, because instead of having to pay a monthly fee and stuff like that, you could just buy it once and you just keep it, which is a much better like business model and also more affordable.
Yeah, better for the customer, perhaps.
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. That's really interesting. It's worth noting, Rebecca. I think you've probably got like a big how to disconnect from proprietary software project somewhere that you need to do. So, okay, we've got a question for Eustace. So we'll start with those. Eustace, I would like to know, while your topic is centered on males, what insights would you like females to gain? And how do you ensure that females are not confused by the topic or some unique aspects of males during the game?
Yeah, so while the game centered around male and the main audience while I was designing it was considering males, but we do know that these type of toxic masculinity, of course, are affecting women and every different gender. And we can see that in like domestic abuse, for example, how the partner will claim that the man is not a man enough, that he can provide for the family, etc. So I think it's important to for everyone to reflect on those topics and how we engage with masculinity. So I would like for females as well to kind of look around and see how we portray men around in media. Same as, we're concerned how we're portraying women in media. I feel like we should start having a conversation how we're portraying everyone and how we can make it a bit more inclusive.
It seems that the game itself also generally encourages dialogue as well as reflection. So there is an opportunity for people to inhabit those. In some ways, they're slightly absurd, some of the scenarios, etc. But that's what makes it a bit accessible to perhaps anybody. I would.
Yeah, I would. Say so.
Nice. Okay. And we had another question from Carol. How do you think superhero movies could change their image of masculinity?
I think it's all about being inclusive and showing different types of masculinities. And it already happened. Like we have some movies, for example, Magical Beasts and Where to Find Them, was another movie, which has the main character, but the main character is nothing what you would consider your regular superhero or your regular person, the main character of a fantasy action scene movie, which is he's much more gentle and inclusive and caring, very different, but it doesn't take away from him being the main character. He still faces challenges and solves them problems, but solves them in a bit different way. And I think it's all about that inclusivity.
Great, thank you. And thanks for the questions. I guess I have one very ill-formed question for you, Eustace, so it's probably going to be hard to answer, but I wanted to talk a little bit about how the certain characteristics of the tabletop gaming medium were useful. What was it that made you choose? I think you mentioned why tabletop gaming, but also why the particular actions that you do in tabletop in that particular game that you've made, which is included things like a little bit of role play.
Yeah, so one of the reasons why I chose tabletop gaming as well is because it kind of exists as a different media text. If our regular movies or shows are based on narrative, so it exists outside the player or outside a person who engages it. With tabletop gaming, every scenario, every gameplay you play is different, right? And I thought that was important because it draws from your own kind of unique experience within the game as you're telling these stories. Like I have one experience of what is masculinity, and I've seen, certain examples of masculinity, and I draw from those playing with these cards. And I think it's the same for everyone who plays it. And that's why I thought it's really important to have that personal kind of storytelling aspect to it.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what I had assumed from doing some test playing with you, which was like some of the most impactful and enjoyable bits of it were like bringing yourself to it or bringing your imagination to it, whether it's yourself or whether it's your interpretations of masculinity. So yeah, great. All right, we've got no other Q&A. We've got no other questions in Q&A, so we'll wrap up there. Thank you, Gabe. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Eustace. It's really great to see your projects in a bit more detail. And that is really it, other than for me to remind you again, please come this afternoon to part 2. The bit.ly link you can see there will take you to the Eventbrite. And finally as well, to see the student work in a bit more detail and to see other work from the course, follow this bit.ly link, IID-show-2021. And that's it. Great. Thanks very much, everyone. So hopefully see you this afternoon.
Thank you. Bye.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to part 2 of the Behind the Interface talks, hosted by User Experience Design. I'm Gareth Foote. I am the course leader for BA User Experience Design and the course's former name, Information and Interface Design. So this graduating cohort that are presenting their projects are graduating as BA Information and Interface Design for the final year. The course is 6 years old, and basically I'm going to give you a very quick framing for the course. I'm going to talk just a little bit about the idea of what UXD is in relation to its common perceptions, but also what the students are making of it. And I'll be using kind of UXD as synonymous with information and interface design. So because the two disciplines have just an enormous amount of overlap. So we're growing as a course as well. It's worth noting. The course has 30 first-year students this year, and probably closer to 35 or 40 this next year one group. And partially that might be to do with the fact that UX is a relatively well-known term now in design and creative industries, but it's really hotly contested as a discipline, as a definition of a discipline. It's often used to kind of encompass anything that is a digitally designed interface, for example. And really most design nowadays is digital, so it needs to be slightly more nuanced than that, but we're not quite there yet. And the other reason I wanted to mention this is because we, as a group of, as a course, with the third years, have a lot of discussions about how they define themselves, what kind of designers they want to be. And a lot of the time, the label of UX design is perhaps too narrow focus. And although there are some specific methods that we're very familiar with as part of user experience design as practitioners in that, it doesn't really, what you'll see here today is more representative of what a broader, more expanded discipline of design can be. Yeah, and also the other thing that I've mentioned this earlier on in the talks as well, that the other label that we have to contend with as a UX course is that we are also just BA websites and apps, and that's all we do. But this group, the talks earlier, the talks you'll see now, and the other students have shown me what a vast array of things you can address with this discipline and what the discipline can be. We don't focus simply on instrumental, solution-based designs for interfaces and apps, etc. What really ties this group together and the work they've produced is not UX methods, although they may be employed in their process, but it's the really non-trivial, consequential, and expansive subjects that they're addressing, and then also the rigorous design-led investigations that are required to unpack these subjects and communicate them and address them generally. So what I hope the course has delivered to them, and what they've shown me they're really capable of, is just kind of being aware of the kind of innate complexities of a design practice that is social, political, and often also always aesthetic and often functional as well. So all of those things wrapped up, and I think you're going to see all of those things coming through in these 3 talks as well. I will now pass you on to our first speaker, which is Amara. We're going to have a Q&A at the end, so please, as you're going along listening to the talks, if you have any questions, hold on to them or stick them into the Q&A panel now, if you like. And when it comes to the Q&A at the end, I will relay any text-based questions to the appropriate person. Okay, so it's over to you, Amara, for the Welding Initiative.
Thank you. So I'm Amara, and I did a project called the Welding Initiative. And basically, I'll give you an overview of what that was. So it focused on how we can address the decreasing bee population or pollinator population. So the bee population has been decreasing rapidly, and about 13 bee species are extinct in the UK, and 25 are on the endangered species list. And one of the major factors of this is the lack of land or wild land for pollinators. So we've lost about 97% of these lands in the last 60 years. And bees pollinate over 75% of the world's crops. And if they go extinct, then it's a huge problem for our ecosystems, and also for our global economies, because it would cost a lot of money to human pollinate every single plant, and yeah, it'd be pretty devastating. So when I started this project, I didn't, obviously you don't know where you're gonna end up. So my before kind of statement or thought was to address the decreasing bee population in urban areas specifically, by raising awareness, or maybe like tackling the issue if that was possible, and doing that by increasing the local bee population. And then through the project, the outcome kind of ended up being this end-to-end user product experience using like digital and physical things together, artifacts together. And this is to increase planting of wildflowers. And so this included a website, a kit, and a community app. And today I'm just going to talk through the user journey between these three aspects of my project. So the first aspect is the Welding Initiative. And that's a website. Sorry, I'm just getting a bit funny. So the website is this like information hub and kind of encapsulates everything that happens in this project. And so the start, so yeah, sorry. The first, so over here, I'll just go through this. The issue page is kind of not this in-depth, crazy scientific guide. It's more just a kind of jumping off point if people wanted to learn more. And if people don't want to learn more and they just want like the raw facts or a quick video, that's also there for them. So at the bottom here, you see just like really quick facts. And at the top, there's like a video that really explains this issue quite well. But for the more in-depth reader or user, they could also learn more about the key issues and so why the bee population is decreasing. And then also I put like a reading list in here. And this is scientific articles and why small spaces can really make quite a big difference to bee populations. So yes, this is the information page. And then the next page on the menu is the kit. And I created this kit to allow people just to throw them on window sills, and it kind of should work as like a harmonious habitat by itself, and with the user or participant just watering it every once in a while, making sure it's all okay and cleaning everything once a year, and then it should be good to go. But I wanted this focus to be on materials because I think we're too focused on materials and not focused enough, if that makes sense, where we like things, but we don't think of what they're made from. So I wanted there to be this big focus. And so you could buy it, but you could also make the kits. And there's like an in-depth guide of how to make the kits. And the last page is the Welding community and the other communities that are really good to join as well. So this was the first stepping off point for the user, just to kind of discover this project in whole or just aspects. And then the second part of the journey is the kit itself. And this includes planters, bee hotels, soil drainage, and then instructions on how to do it, how to make it, and when the flowers will actually bloom. So it's kind of more involved. But I think this was really interesting for me because I didn't know much about product design or material design before this, and I used this material that might look a bit odd, but it's called Mycelium. It's a mushroom vegetation, and it's really good for bees. Funnily enough, it actually boosts bees' immune system, so helps them like fight off pesticides and all that bad stuff. And so it kind of works with this perfect like material as like plastic almost. It's waterproof, water resistant, and really malleable, but also it's good for bees. So that was kind of cool. And these were all the materials I used to make this kit. So that was kind of fun. And so this would be the second stage of the user journey, and the last stage, and hopefully the continuous stage of this journey or this initiative, is this app. And it's a community app, and it's meant to only focus on where the user lives, so a rough neighborhood of users, and together they can talk, and it's like a forum or feed, and they can ask for advice or just give tips and tricks. Like this year we went it was snowing till really late in the year, so it was too cold to put seedlings out. And then there's like 2 weeks many weeks where there's no rain. And so it's all very confusing when you plant and you don't really notice if you don't. And having forums and just asking questions can be really helpful. And then the second part of this app is this kind of tracking system. So you can track where you are and gain badges. And then this also leads to like a community update. So where are other people in the community at? How many people have flowers? How many people have seen bees? Like how effective is this project actually being? So this is kind of a continuous stage. And this is just to like collect data, but also to give support to users as well. So yes, thank you. That was the end of the project.
Thank you, Amara. Great. Okay, bear with me 1 second. Okay, so that was Amara's project, the Welding Initiative. I was going to say beforehand, but I forgot to how incredibly vast Amara's knowledge of bees and the damage we're doing to them became through this project. It was quite eye-opening to talk to her about it. So yeah, have a look at the website. We'll pop one of us will pop the URL into the chat. Second, we have Christine and her project, or her talk, Lost and Found, celebrating the transcultural identity through co-design process. And yeah, so Christine's project is immense in terms of scale, and it's quite fairly complex, a ambition and a realization as well. And I think so Christine's going to talk about a small portion of it. And yeah, I'll just pass you over to Christine.
Hi everybody. Give me 1 second. Just gonna share this. Okay, so yeah, I'm Christine, and I'm going to talk to you to my final major project, which is called Lost and Found. Yeah, so to begin, I'm just going to give you a quick overview of what the project was about.
I think we might have lost Christine.
So Lost and Found is like, okay.
Sorry, folks, bear with us 1 second while we deal with the inevitable bandwidth problems. Christine's going to rejoin in a second. And she's back. You're on mute. You're on mute at the moment, Christine.
Okay. Hi, I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
Carry straight on.
We're very used to this by now, aren't we?
Yeah. Where did I lose you guys?
Pretty
Just
much at the
from
beginning. Yeah, let's start again.
Okay. Can you see? 1 sec.
Yes, we can see Figma.
Okay. 1 sec. Okay. I'm going to start from the beginning. Okay, so my project's called Lost and Found. And basically, yeah, I'm going to give you a quick overview right now. So Lost and Found was a cultural examination aimed at exploring the immigrant and diaspora community with a very specific focus on second generation and multi-generational immigrants. And what I wanted to do with this project was really to find a way to celebrate and monumentalize kind of this cultural group that felt quite new. It's like quite complex and ever-changing and expansive. And I did this through an ethnographic lens, looking at exploring and collecting stories, relating them back to artifacts and objects, and then attempting to build some sort of archive or museum for this specific cultural group. So first off, I'm going to talk about my inquiry, and this is where I began my project. It was a 3-step process, and it kind of allowed me to gain a bit more of a nuanced understanding of the subject before I started designing or diving right in. And so the first step was to define the multi-generational immigrant experience. And I did this through a
Christine,
series.
just before we carry on, just to make sure, are we expecting to see some slides changing?
Do you see furthering my inquiry?
No, we just see your Figma interface at the moment.
What? Okay. Give me a sec. Let me stop sharing and start again. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Okay.
There we go. Yeah, we can see
There?
it. So you were saying
Okay.
about defining the multi-generational immigrant.
Yeah. Can you see this?
Loud and clear. Yeah, see it.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so defining the multi-generational immigrant came with preliminary interviews and some readings and of like anecdotes and testimonies I found online and in books. And from that research, I was able to kind of determine that this experience was one fraught with tension. And this is mostly because it's a condition that is often devalued by societies, the societies that it sits in, and often dictated by the narratives that aim to flatten their complexities rather than celebrate them. And mostly because they're defined by their proximity to fully formed historical identities rather than being able to exist as their own thing. And so this leaves many individuals sitting within this space feeling a sense of solitude or confusion, and those stresses can, once they proliferate, can manifest into internalized racism or heightened social anxieties, and etc. So the second part of the process was to kind of understand why, or examine why, this kind of position is fraught with so much tension. And I was looking at kind of the bigger picture things, or the bigger forces surrounding this specific identity. And I narrowed down to the idea of like the narrative of the multi-generational immigrant, who's dictating it and who's defining it. And from there, I was able to kind of examine the dichotomy between history versus storytelling. And this is because when I was looking at like historical accounts or narratives of the immigrant experience, there was no face, there was no identity and no complexity to it. And often these experiences were pigeonholed into harmful stereotypes and kind of almost blame, shame kind of categories. And so as I continued my research, I found that there was no real history or authentic history that I could find. And questions came up in my head where I was asking what is our artifact? What is the multi-generational immigrants? Where is the multi-generational immigrants like museum? Where's their archive? Where can I go see like our history? And it became quite evident that that was not necessarily, there was no space that necessarily existed like that. So on the other hand, I found storytelling was a practice that where I found authentic narratives, and that storytelling was within like the families and communities of diaspora and multi-generational immigrants. And that's where I found almost a solidarity in our experiences and kind of our history. And so the next step was kind of a way to reframe the immigrant experience and almost recharacterize how we perceive this identity from the inside the community and as well as outside. And this came with the idea of reframing the multi-generational immigrant experience as a trans condition, so also known as transcultural or transnational. And it was a way to kind of shifting the narrative to see it as like almost revolutionary or utopian, and like a rejection of colonialist binary attitudes rather than something that exists in constant tension and as a disappointment or within proximity to other historical identities. Nadia Yalakisakidi, she wrote an essay called Geopolitics of the Diaspora, and she explains it so well. In this quote, she says, "This is a utopia of diasporic existence, to be present in two worlds at once in spite of the poor dialectics that link them, and to make it possible in each of them to inhabit and to develop the possibilities of a life in spite of it all." So then from there, I had 3 major project goals, and on the left are some of the themes that I looked into, but I won't go into them today. My 3 goals were to create an archival history for the transcultural, transnational identity, create a practice in representing and celebrating the multifarious condition of the multi-generational immigrant, and also to create a sense of curiosity, collectiveness, and naturalization around telling diaspora stories, which are defined by the storyteller. So today I'm only going to speak about this specific part of my project. It's called the Reinventing of the Monument, and it was achieved through a co-design process. So what does reinventing the monument mean? It's basically a consideration of how we can celebrate transcultural identities outside of current methods of celebration. So when I was traveling or challenging the London city landscape, it was obvious that the kind of dominant ways of celebration were restricted to colonial structures and white institutions, and they had a really like cultural permanency to them. And the notions of uniformity and heritage somehow like saturated the city. So it was like inevitably denying opportunities for change. And that was like faulting a demographic that had obviously evolved past a single white identity. And so this project, and specifically Reinventing the Monument, was a way to establish new locations and reinvent the monument to create more evolved forms of monumentalization, and kind of allow for these spaces of celebration to exist outside of official designation of white colonial heritage and restricted permanency. So the Reinvented Monument itself was a balancing act of both celebrating an individual's unique makeup, but also creating a monument that celebrates the similarities in experiences and objects and materials of a wider community. So we distanced while I was working with each of these participants, we tried to distance our representation away from the individual's likeness and considered how we can represent an identity through the makeup of objects. And this was a drawing kind of from the practice of the totem, which is a monument that is celebrated, that creates a form of celebration through an arrangement of symbolic objects rather than an individual. So designing the Reinvented Monument was driven by a co-design process that I designed, and I did it with 6 multi-generational immigrant participants, and it included an interview and 2 generative activities. So I'm going to go through how I designed kind of the co-design process. So I wanted the first part to be an interview, and I had 2 kind of interview processes designed. And I was kind of considering the knowledge level of each participant to the themes, and I intuitively chose which one was right for each individual. So the first one was a basic interview, which involved more structure, and it included some like introductory quotes on the themes from Kisukidi, Le Guin, and some other like writers and thinkers. And then from there, I would prompt the participant with questions, using up follow-up questions, and it'll become a free flow discussion. And what I really wanted from this process was to create something that allows people to talk about their personal, maybe traumatic experiences in a comfortable way. And the other process interview process was a deep discussion, involved less structure, and was more of a conversation between myself and the participant and the sharing of our experiences. And it worked better for a lot of these individuals as it was not so restrictive on the train of thought and allowed them to open up freely. And so the second part of the interview process, I asked each of the participants to bring in 4 to 6 different artifacts that kind of linked stories to their memories and their experiences as transcultural identities. And so this was really an exploration in the practice of speaking through objects. I was really interested in the way that specific memories can be linked to specific objects. And it also allowed, I think, the user to feel more comfortable in an interview process. When you're recalling memories, it doesn't work so well when you're thinking on the spot, but when you have had the moment to collect these artifacts and present them, there's less of there's less friction in that train of thought. So that was a way of another way of making the interview process and this co-design process as comfortable for the participant as possible. And from there, these are some of the artifacts that the participants brought in. And it was really interesting as I began to collect, because it felt like I was collecting almost this archive or this museum, or building this museum as I kind of planned at the beginning. And as I started to bring them all together, it became this beautiful group of objects that just represented this, this cultural group. And then the second part was this generative workshop, where I asked them to basically think about totems and how they're an arrangement of objects, and think about how their artifacts can act in the same way. And so I asked them to draw on paper several different ways they can imagine their objects becoming a monument of their transcultural identity. And then from there, I asked them to transition that into a 3D form, just so they can imagine it within space and within location. And these are just some of the results that I got from different participants. So this is May. This is the generative workshop, and this is kind of the stories that she linked with her artifacts. I'm not going to go through them now. And then this is Jordan as well. He's British Caribbean, but born in London, but grew up in Italy, and these are some of his artifacts as well. And it was really great because some of the participants were creators themselves, and Jordan is a musician, so he sent me a song based on one of his artifacts, which was really nice. But I'm going to go into one of the designs for basically this is the design for Jordan's artifact, and one of his artifacts was a puppet, and it's related to a memory that he has of his grandfather, who's Caribbean. And basically when he grew up in Italy, he had lost his Caribbean side quite a bit. He'd lost that culture. And when his granddad came over, the only way they could connect was over this puppet toy, and it was this common ground for them. And it was such a beautiful story. You can read it maybe later on, I'll send you guys it, but it is such a lovely story. And this is a way of for me anyways, the whole idea was that it was beautiful creating these reinvented monuments, but what was so special about them was their connection to stories. And so these are just some of the reinvented monuments that I made. And then, oh yeah, quickly, this is the other part of the project that I'm not going to go into in depth, but basically all of these monuments will exist in an augmented reality experience that the user can, so the audience kind of can interact with these monuments and read the stories behind them and see them exist in London space and find them within their neighborhood. So it's a whole idea of almost claiming space in London for this specific cultural group. And that's it, done.
Thanks very much, Christine. Super interesting. Greatly appreciate it. Okay, let me share my screen. and start my video. Right, okay. So I think your mic might still be on, Christine. Okay, moving on. We now have Matt Richmond and his project Community Gardens. And another project that's heavily involving a co-design process, which I think is probably what we'll hear a bit about shortly. So I'll pass you straight over to Matt.
Okay. Yeah, so my project was called Community Gardens. And so kind of an overview of the project. It was a sort of workshop and design process exploring digital community placemaking and specifically drawing insights from the sort of temporary digital spaces that were used by various communities during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so I invited groups to participate in a remote workshop to learn how they interacted during the pandemic, and then use that to sort of imagine a digital space that was sort of catered to their specific interactions and their specific needs. So just sort of a context for the whole project. This is a quote from researcher Olia Lialina, who sort of examines the transition from Web 1.0 to Web 2.0 and sort of these very like interactive technologies and how they sort of over time became quite standardized and lost this sort of level of autonomy. And her quote here is, what were the most important developments for web history in 2004? The birth of Facebook and the announcement of Web 2.0. And these events marked the beginning of a new era, a modern web, the web that we are still in today. A web where the role of the user is not to build the web, but to generate content and data. A web where the gap in between users and developers is unbridgeable. And so kind of using that as a theme for the project, I was interested in sort of exploring this gap between earlier technologies which invited communities to participate and to build spaces, sort of these like Web 1.0 technologies, as they're called, like places like GeoCities, even like early social media sites like MySpace and stuff like that, which kind of just allowed you a lot more room to kind of develop your own space and decide how it would be used. And then there's a sort of transition to, there we go, Web 2.0, which is much more prescriptive and much more uniform in the way that it can be used. And rather than the user sort of dictating how the space will be used, the space dictates how the user will use it. And I was interested because it kind of presents this certain juxtaposition where we find ourselves, we're more connected and more able to connect with our peers and our fellow community members. But in the same way, we're sort of stifled and less able to communicate in the ways that we might choose to. And then I was interested because obviously over the pandemic, we all sort of engaged in these sort of makeshift communities. It's a little GIF of some of my friends. And everybody sort of participated in these sort of makeshift communities in this way. And different groups sort of kind of creatively pieced together all these different technologies and sort of, you know, reworked them or used them in tandem with other technologies, or sort of broke them and tried to use them in different ways than they were meant to be used. And I was sort of interested in that because it's a sort of like, just like homemade sort of retaking of the internet that happened on this massive scale. And so I was particularly interested in using that as a way to sort of research how we might go about creating better or more sort of autonomous and purpose-built, like almost public spaces, but in a sort of digital realm. And so I started looking at ways to do that. And I became particularly interested in creative workshopping as a sort of means to allow community members to give input and actually create their own digital spaces. And going back to that sort of Web 1.0 analogy, like, you know, that's kind of what GeoCities and all these sites allowed people to do, was to actually create their own personal spaces. The problem is that now you kind of need more specialist knowledge to be able to create something more interactive. So I decided to create something that was kind of a co-design workshop where the community members would give input, and then I would take that and design a site or design a prototype for a site that would work specifically exactly how they wanted it to and serve all the sort of interactive functions that they needed. And sort of do this as an exploration. So rather than immediately try to come up with a solution or some sort of a new platform like GeoCities or MySpace, I thought just explore this space and do some interviews and with different groups and different communities and see what they might build for themselves. So I sort of thought, or develop a workshop that sort of allows these communities to discover, or well, first to gather how they'd been interacting during the COVID-19 pandemic, what technologies they've been using, how well this was working for them, how they'd sort of like pieced things together and get an insight into that. And then learn how these groups functioned in real life and how they communicated and who their community members were, and how they sort of like would traditionally function. And then use this information to let them ideate digital interactions for themselves that sort of serve their specific needs. And then also use a sort of analogy of physical placemaking, because you always hear this, like in my research, it kept coming up over and over again, this idea of like public spaces or like gardens or like public parks, like digital public parks, which I think becomes quite hard for most people to actually visualize. So I decided to kind of add this element of like physical placemaking to it, and really kind of like try to work through it with the stakeholders to try to see what they would sort of build for themselves. So I went about sort of creating a workshop for that. Obviously, one of the key challenges here was that at the time, it would have been illegal to have that kind of a workshop. And obviously a lot of the people who would be like participating were in remote locations. So I decided to create an online remote workshop. I used Miro, used the Miro board, and I created this sort of like, this whole process with all these different steps to it that sort of combines different elements of user research and sort of creative workshopping to establish, first to establish, you know, how the community functions, and then to sort of walk them through it. So there was different steps. Step one was about defining the community. The participants would sort of outline how their community functions, what their community's purpose was, who the fellow group members were, and how they had been communicating over the pandemic. Step two was about outlining what the community needed. So using these sort of like various like pieced together technologies they've been using, how had they been communicating, and sort of use that to figure out what exactly they would need. And then step three is about kind of transposing these needs and sort of their physical interactions, their traditional interactions, into digital interactions, and sort of ideating through that. And so I sort of used some user research methods for that. things like, you know, like post-it note boards, and then a round of voting at the end, to sort of ideate through things and just really try to like coax ideas from the community members, and try to get them to really ideate through and come up with their own ideas about what they wanted. And then step 4 was about taking these different interactions and these different features and actually figuring out like how they would fit together, how they would function, and how they would want an actual physical space or a digital space to function in the way that their traditional physical spaces did. So here's a little time lapse of a run through that I did. It took about 2 hours, I'd say. Whoa, sorry, it's a little bit dizzying, all the panning out. But that's a sort of condensed version of it. And it went quite well. And I think they really responded quite well to the prompts, and they came up with some sort of very unique ideas. Every group kind of came up with very specific ways that they would want to function, and different interactions that they would need for their group. And then they sort of like, yeah, everybody came up with really interesting ideas during the sort of placemaking round, because everybody kind of envisioned it differently. And then at the end, we all just kind of went through and talked about it and talked about how this sort of like physical placemaking would translate into a digital space. And it was fun. You could kind of see the wheels turning, and people kind of enjoyed trying to design their own digital space, because it's really not something that they had been asked to do before. So here's like a little clip of a tidied up version of the workshop after it was completed. And so then I took these ideas and I just sort of tried to, I mean, by the end of it, you kind of had a pretty crystallized idea of what they wanted just through discussing it. And so then I just went about and I sort of took these ideas, tried to keep the design pretty minimal, and just created basically exactly what they asked for. So this one is for a group that was meeting. I think they graduated during the pandemic from a short course in screenwriting at UCLA. And so I interviewed them, and the key takeaways from their workshop were basically that they had been using Google Documents to post all of their short stories and their scripts that they were writing. But it was just getting really hard to organize them and to manage them. And they also felt that there was a lack of sort of personal connection in the way that Google Docs allows you to edit. So, you can add a little comment to some text, but there's sort of no personality behind it. And it doesn't really feel like you're interacting with your classmates. It just feels like you're leaving them, editor's notes. And so they wanted a way to make the stories feel more personal and personalize the stories a little bit more, and have more of a kind of interactive space. And they sort of imagined sort of a place where it would list the stories, and you could have a title, a banner image for each story, sort of like your book cover. And then I'll just go ahead and walk through it. So this is where the sort of book covers comes in on the front page. And then as you scroll through them, when you actually click into one of the stories, you're presented with the actual story. And then users can go through and highlight pieces of text. And instead of it simply displaying sort of a little note that comes up, you get a little chat box function on every single note. So every time a user adds a little thing, other users can come through and add their own comments to what the first person wrote, and then they can reply and have a conversation about that specific thread. Or they could just do something like leave a YouTube video or leave a relevant image or something like that. Yeah, and so that's just an example of one of the sort of interactive spaces that were the outcomes of these workshops. Yeah, I think overall, the idea was just to explore how we could create better community spaces. It was kind of an interesting learning process, trying to sort of like design this workshop and then have a whole remote workshopping session. And yeah, I think overall the sort of, it sort of comprises a design process that kind of explores how we could create better platforms for community spaces and sort of offer the autonomy and the personalization of Web 1.0 with the sort of interactive capability and more immersive experiences of Web 2.0. Yeah, I'd say that's it.
Thanks very much, Matt. Great. Okay, so thanks very much for all of those presentations, Amara, Matt, and Christine, and particularly Amara for being up at whatever ungodly hour this is in California. So we're going to have a quick Q&A, throw a few questions at three presenters. And so people, please throw some questions into the Q&A panel, and I will relay them to Matt, Christine, and Amara. So Amara and Christine, can you whack your cameras on? Hello. Great, okay. So whilst we wait for people to write in some questions, I've got a few waiting for you. So Amara, so you're like from as long as I can remember, you've been interested in physically making things in your design practice, not necessarily a physical product, but like you've always tinkered with electronics, etc. I just wondered if you could tell us why that's important in your practice, and maybe in particular in this one. I think it's because it's particularly relevant, perhaps.
Yeah, for sure. I think I really like mixing digital and physical things. So I always think it's nice to either hold something or to interact with something in real life. And so I just like having a physical aspect to my projects. It makes it feel a bit more real and something that like exists, not just in like this digital world, but it also most of the time requires action. And I think, as like Matt said, the internet's very like consumer or like driven or content driven. And like I think physical materials require users to have action, and I like that aspect of it. So I think that's why.
Yeah, especially when we've all been stuck in our virtual worlds for the last year and a half.
Yeah, for sure.
What about specifically those materials you used? Because I'm not sure if you 100% described and I don't need you to go into all of the deep depth of it, but in particular, there was an ethos behind these materials.
Yeah, there was. So like for me, it was sorry, it's still early. My voice hasn't been done yet. But I think with this project especially, I tried to be really, really conscious about how I used materials and how sustainable materials are. And obviously it's not 100% sustainable, but it's close, and it's like this effort that we all need to make things and materials sustainable. And so I used Mycelium, which is obviously biodegradable because it's a natural material, and it's quite durable as well, so it should last a while. But to make those Mycelium pots, I had to make molds, and the molds were made from plastic that couldn't be recycled, which I didn't find out till quite later on, which was unfortunate. So I decided to grind those plastic excess waste basically up, and then they could be used as drainage at the bottom of the pots, so that the plants didn't get root rot basically. And so it was kind of using a material to its fullest, and so I didn't just like throw it away once it was done. I was like, okay, how can I reuse this? And the bags themselves are made from like recycled cotton, but if I was to do this again, I'd probably use more like it's called dead stock. So when clothing manufacturers order fabric and they don't use it, it just goes to waste. So I would probably use some of that or something like that. Yeah, I think materials are super important, basically.
Yeah, and in your projects in particular, I guess there's an authenticity to the fact that everything is all about maintaining that level of sustainability throughout it and improving it. Thank you, Amara. And Christine, I love Bop It. It's a great game. I'm really a big fan of it.
I haven't even showed you guys the track that guy made. Did you listen to it when?
We don't think we heard that. No, it would be really good to maybe you can share that as well.
Yeah.
I was taken by the fact that Bop It is actually like a really interesting physically shared thing you do as well. For those who perhaps haven't played it, you can do it as a single player or a 2-player, and you just have to hit different bits of this object that's making noise. And it struck me that's almost like a trans object in itself, and it sort of bridges these two people, bridge generations. And I wonder whether it's that's somewhat what you're. Was that resonate with you when you were doing these interviews with, was it Jordan?
Yeah, Jordan. Yeah, I mean, like, his story is really interesting because I think there was another level where he was two distinctive, like, gene-made identities, right? But then he also lived in another country that was very separate from both his original identities, and that was like actually what kind of started carving his identity, because he grew up in Italy, even though he's British. His parents are British and Caribbean, so that was like kind of like the significant thing that kind of molded his identity. Because if he grew up in London, being Caribbean and London and British, that's not so peculiar, because there is actually quite a lot of people who have that identity. But growing up in Italy, it was like almost he was made a singular kind of person in its own. And then the idea of like the puppet was really interesting, because I think there's also something really nice about the puppet where it's like you don't even have to communicate to know how to play it. Like, you can exist in like different languages, different cultural groups, and it's such a physical form of like not connection, but like it's such a physical and very intuitive game to play. And yeah, no, it was just beautiful when he was telling the story, and all the other stories are really nice. I kind of wish I could have shared it with a lot more people, but they all have this like, it's like it's weird, it's like you read them and then it's such a mundane story. And I think that's like something that's quite beautiful about this history of the trans cultural identity, or collecting these artifacts, is that everything's so mundane about them, but there is something so like relatable, or what's the word, like something so much more special about them that you can actually see across all transcultural identity. And that's the thing, it's like when I was like going forth, I had actually thought about this thing specifically about one cultural group. So I was thinking like, oh, I'm going to go forth going into the idea of like what it's like to be East Asian. But then like as I started talking to different people and speaking about actually this transcultural minority is its own like force in itself, and like exploring that is so much more interesting than just like being like, oh yeah, Chinese Australians or like Chinese British or Indian British have such a specific way of living, and then we're going to explore that. But like this idea that there's something so like relatable and I can't think of the word right now. What's the word where it's like it goes across everything?
Ubiquitous.
Ubiquitous, yeah. Yeah, there's something so ubiquitous about these stories.
Yeah.
Anyways,
yeah, it's elevate. Yeah, it really like nicely elevates the everyday to something so poignant because of what it's doing for these individuals, but there it's also small small cultural groups that are really multi-layered and diverse and ever-changing as well. It's a really beautiful thing. I really think it's wonderful. Did you find it tricky to do this yourself because it was a personal thing as well? Did you, when you're doing these interviews and you're being very considerate of the sensitivity of this experience, but actually it started from your own personal experience as a second generation immigrant?
I actually think it was like really helpful that I had been in some similar experiences to the participants. Because like I said, with like one of the designs for the interview process was a deep discussion, and without my own like ability to pitch in and relate and share my stories, those discussions wouldn't have existed, like wouldn't have like become what they were. And like, to be honest, I was a little bit worried when I first started doing it because I'm not from London. And that's like a different thing. And this project was specifically situated in London. And so I was worried that my perception and my experiences, which originate from being Australian, Chinese Australian, would kind of cloud how I saw people growing up here. But it took me like, I think at the beginning, I did have like a bit of problem because I was trying to shape people's stories and I was trying to draw things out that I felt were more specific to how I felt. But then as like time grew on and I like kind of practiced the interview process a little bit better, I actually was able to like kind of hold back on my emotional part and allow kind of their input being just as it is. Like some people really grew up fine here and they actually loved like the beautiful mixture of identities and they've always felt accepted. Whereas there will be other people whose stories were much more like about like the traumatic side, which is more in tune with how I felt about my experiences. And so when sometimes when I was talking to people who never felt that like othering, or they never felt the like kind of like outsidedness in their upbringing, I would try and push that a little bit, but it wasn't right for me to do that, you know. And then after a while I began to kind of just be like accept what people told me, and each story was just as valuable as the next. And I think that's the thing, it was always about like every story is valid and every story has purpose and has meaning. You know, I'm not trying to build like an agenda with this. It's just about collecting these stories.
It's hard to, it's hard to stay neutral, but that's also part of the learning experience, is to and also as a learning experience as a sort of empathetic designer and researcher, is to be able to sit outside of that and allow people to speak for themselves, which I think you did really well in the end, in the end result. And so yeah, thank you very much, Christine. One more question for Matt, or maybe a couple of questions depending on how we do this. I wanted to, I'm not sure if you mentioned how important, or if it was really important to use this metaphor of gardens. I know it came up in some of your research, but then you've chosen to make this project called Community Gardens, or call the project Community Gardens. I'm wondering, is the metaphor of the garden really super relevant to the process that you were going through, or for the people who've taken part?
In a way. I sort of just kind of used that, I think, throughout the project as a sort of anchor, as a way of sort of imagining it. I think honestly, even for me, who's someone who's grown up as a sort of digital native, like I have a hard time sometimes imagining what this sort of like, there's always this metaphor of like cyberspace or like virtual space, but it's really intangible. And especially considering like a lot of the people that I was interviewing were from all sorts of different backgrounds, and some were a lot older. I felt like I really needed to find a way to like ground this sort of like digital exploration in some sort of a physical exploration. And during my research, that just kept coming up. They kept talking about, and initially sort of some of my inquiry was kind of into like the disappearance of physical spaces, and sort of like how there was kind of a growing necessity for creating as all this interaction was becoming digital, there was like a growing necessity for sort of digital spaces. And you just keep seeing that analogy coming up. Like it always gets compared to sort of like a public park. And in the same way, basically, that you need public spaces in cities and stuff like that, you know, there needs to be public spaces in this sort of like, yeah, cyberspace. But as far as like actually designing something like that, I became really interested in using that analogy to sort of root it and create a strong metaphor and something that people could actually like imagine and work through during the workshop. And so that's why I chose to kind of do that. And also sort of the way that it manifested, where instead of creating one big thing, I sort of thought I'll interview different groups and see how each group sort of manifests a digital space. And so I just felt like in that way, this sort of like community, like allotments type of thing going on again. And even in the way that like GeoCities presents itself, as each sort of area is listed as an actual city, it just kind of has this, there's like this kind of thread that runs through the whole thing, where I just think it somehow helps people to think of digital spaces as physical spaces. And it's they're going to be replacing a digital space that you either, you know, either they're disappearing, or during the COVID pandemic, you couldn't go to them. So like you had to create a digital version of it.
I thought the use of metaphors seems to be really important in the discussions you have with people to help them imagine what their spaces could be like, especially when we've had a lot of many years of just very pared down, locked down proprietary space, public online spaces. And the garden's a nice metaphor in terms of it being tended, and the allotments in particular are like tended spaces that change and grow with various input at different times. And that seems to be perhaps what you could do with this and are doing, but that maybe that there's another iteration, a cycle, that something that comes after the making of the platform that allows those people to continue to bug you to make new interesting things for them.
Yeah, definitely. It's kind of this whole ongoing process. And honestly, it's just been this kind of amorphous project that just keeps changing every time I start working on it again. It's like I realized like, oh, I kind of need to change certain aspects of it, especially like the workshop itself. But yeah, that particular narrative of sort of like creating that analogy seems to work really well for people. And I was actually, originally, I tried it and I thought it wasn't going to work. Because at the end, there's literally just a part where I say, like, take some time to sort of like just actually draw like what you're picturing in your head into a physical like place. And it can be anything. It could be a garden, it could be a building, it could be whatever you're thinking of in your head. And I just thought I'll just go for it for the sake of seeing what comes out of it. And I actually was like really impressed with the results. And I think that more than anything else, more than the sort of more traditional like design sprint or design challenge kind of techniques that I used, like I used like a sort of like post-it notes and then voting system at one point. But more so than anything, that sort of like drawing the physical space, I think drew out the most conversation and the best ideas. And then of course made it that much easier for me to sort of like take that and digest it and actually turn it into something like tangible and functional and usable. So yeah, it was interesting. I think definitely there's a long way to go as far as like refining that whole process. Yeah, it's just,
there's always more. There's always more refining. It's never ending. So.
Yeah, just like every time it's like a little bit different.
Which is the joy as well.
Yes, the joy and the pain.
The joy and the pain, yeah. Fun. Well, on that note, we will wrap up. Thank you, you three. It's wonderful to see you speaking about your projects again. Now you can forget all about them for a little while at least. Some of you are going to re-engage, I'm sure, I hope. Yeah, that's it really. Thanks everybody for coming. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you all soon. Cool. Bye-bye for everyone.